Hello, I chose Canada as my country, so today I'm going to talk about climate change in Canada. So to begin, I'll talk a little bit about fresh water in Canada because water is one of the most essential resources and it will only become more important as climate change progresses. And it's a very important issue right now and it will only get more important as time goes on. So Canada is a country with a lot of fresh water. Almost 9% of Canadian territory is water, whether it be ponds, lakes, rivers, and Canada has an estimated 3 million lakes, which is said to be more than all other countries combined. There's a little controversy here about what really goes into classifying a body of water as a lake. So there's not a consensus, but as you can see by this map of global lakes, Canada is just covered in blue up here. The fresh water in Canadian lakes provides drinking water for over 8 million people and supports a quarter of agriculture in the country. So obviously, water plays a huge part in Canada and this everyday lives of its citizens. Canada has 20% of the world's total freshwater resources, but less than half of that, which is about 7% of the global supply, is renewable freshwater. The rest of the water is retained in glaciers, underwater aquifers, and lakes. So this is just a map of the geography of Canada. You can see up here, there's the polar climate and tundra, and then coniferous forest. And the yellow is a more temperate climate like the northern United States, and it's not labeled. But 26% of Canada's landmass is tundra. And I wanted to highlight that as I get into the impacts. Because rising temperatures and sea levels threaten to reduce the size of Canada's tundra, and that makes up 26% of their landmass. Is obviously a huge part of their country. And Canada has a higher rate of warming than most other regions in the world. So that is going to impact tundra more than ever. And as temperatures warm, that'll thaw the ground and that displaces water and it's a whole issue. There's also other impacts that come with climate change, such as migration of species, those endangered species like polar bears and other things that rely on the polar or tundra climate will have to migrate. Also, there could be invasive species migrating with the climate, and locals would have to adapt to that. One of the bigger impacts would be an increase in immigration, because immigration hasn't become very political in Canada like it is in the United States. Canada has one of the most positive immigration policies in the world, and people are drawn to Canada because of its good reputation. They have free healthcare, there's free education, and in fact, immigrants make up about 21% of Canada's population right now. So as climate change becomes more prevalent and more of an issue, there'll be climate refugees, and Canada will become one of the most sought after countries to move to. So is definitely going to play a factor in the everyday lives of Canadian citizens. Another impact of climate change on Canada would be more frequent and severe extreme weather, whether that be droughts or flooding or sea level rise. It can affect a lot of Canada. There's a lot of cities near the sea. They have the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean on either sides of the country. And we saw that fresh water from earlier flooding is obviously going to be a problem. But the biggest impact that I'm going to talk about is the thawing of permafrost. And you can see from the graphic to the right um, some of the impacts of permafrost thaw. You can see on the bottom part that as it thaws, water can leak down further, and this can cause displacement of water, and uh, it would recirculate the water, change the flow. It can change the course of rivers, and so this is going to become a huge problem because it can alter stream flow and discharge of water, which would make for more floods. And as you can see here, this is the limit of permafrost. It covers just about all of Canada at one point or another, and it's just going to keep creeping up. And all this that was permafrost is going to thaw. And the thawing of permafrost has many issues with it. One of it is flooding. The other one is release of greenhouse gases. Permafrost is this land that's been frozen for possibly decades, and it has all this organic matter built up. And as it thaws, this organic matter releases mainly CO2 and methane gases into the atmosphere, which we know are harmful greenhouse gases. Also, with the increased water flow that would come from this, all this organic matter would be swept up and taken into streams, which would contaminate the drinking water, and it would also hurt species like fish that are in the waters in Canada. And as we saw from earlier, this is a blown up image from one of the first slides. All these are the major lakes in Canada. And so as permafrost thaws, this carbon runoff goes into the lakes. All of this is going to be contaminated. And as we saw earlier, 20% of the global supply of fresh water is in Canada. So this is going to be a very big issue going forward. So now I'll talk about why I chose Canada as my country for this project. The main reason is because it's so similar to the United States and we can compare. Obviously, their population's about a tenth of our size, but you can see the size of Canada and the United States is almost identical, and we're both major powerhouses. Our economies are similar. They ranked 9th in GDP last year. We ranked first. And Canada and the United States have the world's largest bilateral trading relationship. So we have a good relationship with them, and they're very similar to us. However, Americans and Canadians differ highly on what they think about climate change. 47% of Americans, as seen in this survey, agree that scientists are overstating evidence about global warming, but only 36% of Canadians think this. 58% of Americans think there's solid evidence of global warming, while 80% of Canadians think there's solid evidence. So people from Canada are obviously taking global warming and climate change seeing it as a bigger problem than people from the USA. Another big difference between Canadians and people from the United States is climate change isn't such a politicized issue in Canada. As you can see here, the gap between conservative and liberal voting is very different on all of these issues. It's much smaller. You can see for the United States it's longer, which means there's more of a separation between ideologies. But in Canada, it's generally closer. So it's much more about the environment than what political side you're on. It is still politicized, but it's on a much smaller scale. And this also shows overall, Canada thinks supporting limiting greenhouse emissions is more of an important idea than people from the United States think. In fact, Canada has a carbon tax on provinces that represent 80% of their population. So Canadians generally see climate change as more of an environmental issue than political issue, and they care much more about it than people from the United States. One other difference was how climate change is portrayed in the media. I found a great paper about this. If you just Google framing of climate change in US and Canada, it's one of the first ones to pop up. Newspapers in the United States were found to be more likely to frame stories about climate change and global warming with discussions of science than were Canadian or international newspapers. And the study found that framing this issue with science often leads to a sense that climate change is uncertain. In fact, about a quarter of all climate change and global warming newspapers and the stories in the United States were framed with science. Canadian newspapers were found to be 3 times as likely to have climate change or to have a climate change or global warming story than American ones. And the United States is more likely to refer to climate issues as global warming, which we all know after taking this course that global warming is a very small part of climate change. So the key takeaways from my presentation is climate change will have a huge impact on Canada's tundra, permafrost, and fresh water. The United States and Canada are very similar, but their citizens have differing views on climate change, and the media's framing of climate change in Canada is very different from the framing in the United States.